Okay, so we're going to talk today about the Potsdam Conference and about a little bit of the atomic weaponry development during the end of the Second World War. So, the Potsdam Conference took place from July 17th to August 2nd in what is occupied Germany. And why was that city chosen? Why was the city of Potsdam, which was a suburb of Berlin, chosen? And the reason why is there wanted to be a political message that it would drive home to the Germans the cold reality of their defeat and would underscore the fact that the Soviets contributed so greatly to that defeat. The big three, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, wanted to leave no doubt in the minds of the German citizens that they had lost the war and that their enemies had completely vanquished them. Uh, Stalin himself wanted Churchill and Truman to see the brutality of the war, to strengthen his hand in demanding heavy reparations and a brutal post-war treatment of Germany. So the gathering was not really there to design a definitive treaty with specific policies to answer, to be held accountable for, but rather than a symbol that the big three stood together and will work in unison to produce a more peaceful future. So this is the last of the big three meetings, as we mentioned. Truman obviously replaced Roosevelt, and Truman was relatively unprepared for the conference. Roosevelt had stopped passing his correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt onto the State Department, and he rarely relied on the State Department personnel at the conferences except for note-taking and the translations. So Truman, again, who had been out of the loop as vice president, doesn't know much. He's not given any information from the State Department because the State Department themselves had not known very much. Most of the decisions that were made during the course of the time were decided by the Americans and the Soviets. All that Churchill was able to provide him for the name was the code name of terminal, meaning it would be the last one. The conference started, but was interrupted by the British general election, which led to Clement Attlee replacing Churchill as prime minister. So during the course of the conference, Churchill actually has to depart to go back to get the returns of the British general election that had been taking place. And in that general election, Churchill was defeated, and he's replaced by his opposition leader, Clement Attlee. Churchill may have lost the election because he compared the Labour Party's opposition to the Gestapo, leading to the belief that he may have frightened the British people and made him seem to be ill-suited to lead the British in the coming peace. Also, there was some legacy of the disastrous peace policy of appeasement that had taken place under Chamberlain. What was kind of an adding insult to injury is that when Churchill was defeated, he had to return back home and be in Britain. The war comes to an end in in August, within a month, and Churchill gets no recognition of his contribution to the war, and in Japan he's not allowed to address the nation at all. So here is what the shape of the Potsdam Conference looks like once Clement Attlee, who is pictured here on the left here, so obviously this is Truman, and here's Stalin. Clement Attlee replaced Winston Churchill. There's a kind of a funny story here about protocols and following instructions and rules and where hierarchy kind of stands in the conference. So Truman introduced one of his bodyguards. He's not in the picture here because those are the foreign ministers. But Truman introduced his bodyguard and a special assistant, a friend and a former federal marshal, so kind of somebody whose job it was in law enforcement, from Western Missouri by his American title as Marshal Fred A. Caniff. The Americans then proceeded to watch the Soviets fall over themselves to try to figure out the correct protocol, since a marshal in the Soviet system was equivalent to a five-star general. And to the continued amazement of the Americans and the senior officers, Soviet senior officers clicked their heels and saluted for the remainder of the conference when the marshal entered the room. So that whole mistaking term of what that word means kind of goes to show the importance of understanding your culture of other countries there. At the site of the meeting, the Soviets planted hundreds of geraniums in a 24-foot wide red star pattern so that all arriving visitors would see there as their cars dropped them off. So you see this picture, it's a red star representing the Soviets. During the evenings, delegates had to entertain themselves. Truman enjoyed listening to piano music, particularly piano music. And when Truman wanted better music, he sent for the best piano player in the U.S. Army, the famous concert pianist Eugene Liszt, and had him flown from Paris, where as a sergeant he was leading the 7th Army Symphonic Orchestra. When Liszt himself wanted different sheet music than that was available at Potsdam, the Americans sent a plane to Paris to get it. And no detail overall seemed too small for those attending the conference to enjoy. So let's talk about the reality on the ground. The Soviets occupied Central and Eastern Europe, which means they controlled Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. There's a puppet government installed in Poland despite the pledge at Yalta for free elections. At the beginning of the conference, obviously, Churchill never really trusted Stalin. He called him a devil-like tyrant who led a vile system, but Churchill obviously was replaced by Attlee. Roosevelt, before the conference, had brushed off the potential of Soviet domination. And this is kind of formed in this quote that we have here that says, I have a hunch that Stalin is not that kind of a man. I think if I just give him everything I possibly can and ask for nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he wouldn't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace. So that's in the letter that he wrote to his ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, that was a little bit too naive. Truman was much more suspicious of the Soviets and of Stalin's intentions. He saw actions in the area as aggressive expansionism, which was against the Yalta agreements. On April 23rd, the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov came to D.C. to put his visits into Truman and to offer his condolences upon the death of Roosevelt and to offer his congratulations upon Truman's rise to the presidency. During the meeting, Truman warned Molotov that the Soviet Union's failure to carry out the Yalta agreements as the Americans interpret them would, quote, cast serious doubts upon our unity of purpose in regard to post-war collaboration, end quote. Truman then interrupted Molotov on at least 3 occasions when the Soviet tried to explain his country's position. The meeting ended with Truman curtly dismissing Molotov, who rose and said to Truman, I had never been talked to in my life like that. Truman replied, carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that again. To Molotov, the meeting symbolized that the era of cooperation with the West had come to an end. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated on May 11th when the ambassador Averell Harriman convinced Truman to cancel American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. Legally, Harriman argued that he had a case because with the end of the war in Europe 3 days later, the Soviets could no longer make use of the aid meant specifically for using in the war against Germany. Truman then signed the drafted order without reading it, and the order even called for the canceling of ships that were at sea to return to American ports. The Americans then blamed the Lend-Lease disruption to a bureaucratic misunderstanding, but the explanation failed to convince the Soviets, who saw in the move further proof that the Americans did not see them as future partners. During the course of the meeting, again to kind of show Stalin's resistance to what was happening, he spent his time drawing pictures of wolves or writing the word reparations over and over and over again. Now, Stalin also kind of used a ploy to get his way in some cases here. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the lectures, Hitler had been dead. There was splashed on the front page of the Times there. But despite the fact that he was dead, what was mysterious was there was no body. There was no body to recover. Now, the Soviets had recovered the body. The Germans had taken his remains outside and attempted to cremate him and Eva Braun's body, but remains were left in the Reich Chancellery courtyard from Hitler's remains. The Soviets captured it. The Soviets took the remains there, did analysis, and found they were Hitler's. But Stalin's going to play a game here in that alleging that Hitler could still be alive and that the threat still existed, and maybe he really wasn't dead because there really wasn't a body. He knew the truth, but dictators don't always tell the truth. And so he said maybe Hitler was still alive with Joseph Goebbels in Spain or possibly Argentina. Both of them had fascist influences. Argentina was ruled at the time by a fascist leader named Juan Perón, and both of those nations had supported the Nazi regime. So this specter of Hitler's ghost kind of still hung over the conference. Now, the other piece here is the big three, was big four, potentially, but with France, because France was free, France was liberated, but de Gaulle was not invited because he was not at Yalta, and there were concerns about reopening the agreed upon points at Yalta worked against him. So, and there was also concern that the French goals would be against those of the British and the Americans. So let's talk about what happens with the agreements at Yalta. The agreements overall, Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, democratized, decentralized, dismantled, and decartelized. So basically breaking up the industrial complexes would all be held in one hands. Germany and Austria would be divided into 4 occupation zones, and the capitals of each, Berlin and Vienna, would each be divided into 4 zones as well. They determined the methods of how the Nazi war criminals would be put on trial, and anything that Germany had annexed during the war would be reversed. So looking at the map of what happens here. Again, that shift. So the yellow had been territory that gets turned over to Poland. So this area and this area had been Soviet territory. This is ceded to Poland again in that great shift of the Polish border to the west in order to give the Soviet Union land on the east, and then the Soviets pick up Königsberg up in this pocket here by this northwest of Poland there. It reduced Germany by about 25% of its 1937 borders. Other pieces were orderly and humane expulsions of German populations remaining east of the new border were to be carried out from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, but not Yugoslavia. So there would be wide-scale movements of Germans, kind of in a way an ethnic cleansing. They weren't going to be executed, but they were going to be moved off their lands into what would be becoming German areas. The other agreement was that freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, religion, and religious institutions would be respected along with the formation of free trade unions. Reparations for the Allies would come from their areas of occupation, and in that case, the Soviets are going to plunder Eastern Germany, removing as much as they could from the area to send it back to the Soviet Union, and the German industrial war potential was to be destroyed. Another agreement with Poland. The provisional government of national unity that was created by the Soviets was to be recognized as the legitimate government of the Polish nation, and the government in exile was out. Secretary of War, the American Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, argued that the Americans should not make much of an issue of Poland because, quote, the Russians with their possession have 99 44% of the law. So since the Russians occupied Poland, there wasn't much we could do, and they just had to kind of live with it. Stalin told Truman not to worry about post-war Poland being multi-ethnic in character because not many Germans remain in the region between the Curzon Line and the Oder-Nesse River. Of course not. Truman's aide Leahy whispered to him, the Bolsheviks have killed them all. The Council of Foreign Ministers would be created. That would be consisting of the foreign ministers of the U.S., Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. And they would be formed to write out the peace treaties with the other nations like Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland. And the final piece of Potsdam is there was something called the Potsdam Declaration, which were signed among the United States, Britain, and China. The Soviet Union was not in the Pacific War. So again, this is going to deal with the war in the Pacific. The Soviet Union's not in there yet. Again, it's reiterating the terms of the unconditional surrender for Japan. The authority and the influence of those who led Japan into war would be removed, which could mean code for the emperor. The Allies would occupy Japan. Japan would only be the four home islands, so Korea would be ceded. Anything else they kept would be taken away from Japan. The military would be disarmed, and war criminals would be dealt with. And part of the Declaration of Potsdam mentioned that if Japan did not agree to the unconditional surrender terms, they could face utter and complete surrender. And why did they utter and complete destruction? Now, why would they use these words? Because as of July 16th, the United States had a new secret weapon. Okay, so that secret weapon is marked here. This is the site that is currently there, but obviously the major thing that happened was the first test of a nuclear weapon in Alamogordo, New Mexico. So this is the first atomic bomb that had been launched, that had been used, not used, but had been tested in the desert of New Mexico. This becomes the new United States secret weapon in the war against Japan and becomes that utter and total destruction that we alluded to. So the atomic bomb, as we know, resulted from a project that was codenamed the Manhattan Project. That was the United States working in conjunction with the British and the Canadians. In 1942 is when it started. It was initially first headquartered in Manhattan, hence the name Manhattan Project. It later on then moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and it was commanded by Army Major General Leslie Groves was the commander of the operations here. Alamogordo, New Mexico was one of the major sites of the Manhattan Project, and that was under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer, who was the lead scientist, and we'll talk about how his role is later on. The Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, cost nearly $2 billion, which would be $20 billion today, and it wound up employing over 130,000 people in various labs and military installations across the United States, Britain, and Canada. The Manhattan Project had its origins in a 1939 letter that's called the Einstein Scissor Letter, and that was a letter that was written by slithered in consultation with fellow Hungarian physicist Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner. The letter warned that Germany might develop atomic bombs and suggested the United States should start its own nuclear program. And that letter that was sent prompted action by Roosevelt, which eventually resulted in the Manhattan Project. And you see here, it's not very clear, but that was the letter that was sent to the president in order to instigate him to launch the Manhattan Project. So in doing so, he created the Advisory Committee on Uranium. These are the various labs that were used throughout the country in order to help build various pieces of it. You see two up here in Canada. There are other pieces out here in Britain, but the major, we already talked about Los Alamos out here and Alamogordo, which is where the Trinity test site was. Other places were scattered throughout the United States. So again, it was kind of this way of diffusing it so nobody quite knew everything they were working on, and yet it was all coming into being. Chicago plays a key role in the Manhattan Project in that on December 2nd of 1942 at the University of Chicago, not too far from us, underneath the stands of Stagg Field, so one of their playing fields, that was where the world's first artificial nuclear reaction took place. It was named Chicago Pile 1, so you could see the structure of the reaction core there, and it was under the direction of an Italian scientist who was living here in the United States named Enrico Fermi. And it was there showing that for the first time, you can control the division of atoms, which ultimately is what powers the nuclear weapon. Other sites then changed uranium into plutonium. So you've got two different pieces here, splitting the uranium atom itself to release the energy, other pieces of changing uranium into plutonium also to release energy. Overall, there were two types of weapons that were developed. There was a simple gun-type fission weapon in which kind of a core shoots at a little bullet of nuclear material shoots at a larger core, and that would cause a nuclear chain reaction. There's the much more complex implosion-type nuclear weapon in which you get a reaction from inside the core to produce the explosion. The project was wrapped in years and in layers of secrecy. So again, knowing that any of these secrets could get out could hamper U.S. war efforts, we made sure we try to keep things quiet. And it was over, so you can see in this graphic here, hey, are your drawers closed? Have you left anything out of the safe? So again, the old pants that used to have your drawers drop, but making sure again that everything in your lab, everything in your place is closed, everything is nothing out there for anybody else to see. And part of the project was also spying on German nuclear research and making sure that the Germans were not getting access to any of our secrets. Here's a description of Robert Oppenheimer's thoughts after the first nuclear detonation that he saw in Alamogordo, New Mexico. It says, if the radiance of 1,000 suns were but to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. We knew the world would not be the same. A few laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another. So you could just see the ramifications that Oppenheimer realized by the success of his project. Now, again, Truman was kept in the dark throughout the entire process. It wasn't until Truman became president that he learned that the United States was perfecting a weapon capable of destroying the entire world. Now, as the head of the committee that was overlooking wastes and spending in the government, he was actually seeing strange earmarks that were going to various entities in the Defense Department and questioning those. But the Defense Department had to kind of say, Senator Truman, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. So he actually was aware of the Manhattan Project through his work as a senator without really being aware of the Manhattan Project until he became the president. When he sat down with General Groves on the 27th, he was handed a full briefing of the project to Truman. He was told that Germany had been close to developing a nuclear weapon in total, and the Soviet Union may have one in 4 to 5 years. So when the information is relayed to Truman at Potsdam that the Trinity, as it was called, success had worked, the telegram to Truman was sent. The words were, operated this morning, diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. Dr. Groves pleased. The next day, another message arrived that read, Dr. Groves has just returned most enthusiastic and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother. The light in his eyes discernible from here to High Hold, and I could hear his screams from here to my farm. Okay, that was a prearranged code that was given to Truman. That meant that the blast could be seen 250 miles from Alamogordo, roughly the distance from Washington, D.C. to High Hold, which was the Secretary of War Henry Stimson's Long Island estate. And its screams, the bomb's noise, could be heard 50 miles away. Truman then told Stalin of the development of the nuclear bomb. The British knew that it was being worked on because they're working with the British, so Stalin was the only one of the big three who was unaware of it. So Stalin informed him. Stalin, though, knew more about the bomb than he let on because he had spies in the project that kept him informed. And so you wonder, like, how would Stalin have known that even this was going on? Why would Stalin have ordered the spying? It's because once the Manhattan Project goes into action, all of a sudden major leading scientists in the physics field just stop publishing things in major scientific publications. And so people are wondering around the world, like, why are all these brilliant people not writing anything anymore about their physics research? And it led people to believe that there must be something going on. And what was going on is they were working for the government and they couldn't reveal what they were doing. So here on this page, we see the memorandum from the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, asking for Truman's permission to issue a press release announcing the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The second page contains Truman's handwritten response granting permission, but asking the release be made no sooner than August 2nd after the conclusion of the Potsdam Conference. So that's what this is here. Don't do anything with the bombing on Hiroshima until August 2nd and Potsdam is over. So this is another note from Truman here that says, in which I tell Stalin to expect to drop the most powerful explosion ever made on Japanese. He smiled and said he appreciated me telling him, but he did not know what I'm talking about, the atomic bomb. So, Stalin played the ultimate poker game, and he just kind of sat there and was coy about the whole thing, even though his scientists had already gotten him news that the atomic bomb had taken place. When Stalin was informed of the successful detonation of the bomb, he then ordered the Soviet Atomic Energy Department to increase its speed on its work, and the Red Army also increased its move to their forces the Manchurian border in the Pacific campaign. So the first test was on July 16th. The news gets to Truman. July 26th, in the Potsdam Declaration, Japan is warned of the destruction they could face, and they're urged to surrender. The 28th, 2 days later, Japan announced that it would continue the war, and then Truman had decided to take action, and so he then ordered that Little Boy, which is a gun-type nuclear weapon powered with uranium, would be brought to Tinian, one of the islands off the coast of Japan, where it'd be ready and prepped to be dropped on Japan in the war. So you could see this is what the Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon used in war, looked like, and we'll talk about more of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki tomorrow. See you later.